Hello. Today I'm going to be discussing Panama and its legacy of foreign intervention, culminating with the 1989 U.S. invasion, Operation Just Cause. Here, I argue that the U.S. invasion of Panama in 1989 was a diversionary war unrelated to any credible national security risk, but rather was launched to serve domestic political purposes. So let's dive in. Like many Latin American countries, Panama has experienced continuous foreign domination and exploitation as a means of controlling its natural resources. Whether this be gold during the period of Spanish conquest, or more recently access and control of the Panama Canal, the December 1989 U.S. invasion was just the latest chapter in Panama's history of foreign intervention, and it is marked by a violation of both international law and human rights. From Panama's earliest exploration, a possible canal connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans had been debated. In 1519, the Spanish crown built a cobbled track in an attempt to join the two oceans, and by 1534, a river was dredged, facilitating traffic for two-thirds of the way. Despite this extreme hardship for workers, particularly those from the West Indies, the Panama Canal was finally completed on August 15, 1914. Because the American-controlled canal zone was established on shaky legal grounds, and that it was never ratified by Colombia or signed by a Panamanian official, controversy over its sovereignty has been a continued source of conflict between Panamanian and American Zonians being American citizens born in the Canal Zone. This conflict came to blows on January 9, 1964, in what would become known as the Martyrs' Day riots. Prior to the Martyrs' Day riots in 1964, President Kennedy had responded to growing tensions surrounding control of the Panama Canal by agreeing to fly Panama's flag alongside the U.S. flag at all non-military sites in the Canal Zone. However, Kennedy was soon assassinated, and the American Zonians refused to carry out his order. This move infuriated Panamanians, who interpreted it as a renunciation of Panamanian sovereignty. Upon hearing of these events, Panamanian students made their way to the Canal Zone with their own Panamanian flag to be raised. The Panamanian students were met by angry Zonians, again, Americans born in the Canal Zone, singing the Star-Spangled Banner. A scuffle broke out, and the Panamanians were driven back by U.S. military police. During the scuffle, the Panamanian flag, which had historical significance, was torn. As word of the flag desecration incident spread, angry Panamanian crowds formed along the border between Panama City and the Canal Zone. At several points, demonstrators stormed the Canal Zone and planted Panamanian flags. Canal Zone police responded by opening fire, which incited a full-scale riot in Panama City. When the dust settled, 28 students lay dead. The events of Martyrs' Day in 1964 would give rise to a new charismatic leader whose demise would set into motion the events leading up to the 1989 U.S. invasion of Panama. In response to the Martyrs' Day violence rose the charismatic military leader Omar Torrijos, who promised Panamanians a repatriation of the Canal Zone and a higher standard of living for Panama's working poor. Torrijos later became maximum leader, or leader maximo, of the Panamanian Revolution, a position that he created for himself to oversee all aspects of the Panamanian government. Torrijos is perhaps best known for negotiating the 1977 Carter-Torrijos Treaty, which gradually granted full control of the Panama Canal to the Panamanian government by 1999. The negotiation of the treaty created a highly volatile political situation in Washington, D.C., with conservative Republicans viewing the ratification of the treaty as a sign of weakness. President Reagan was arguably elected on these coattails, stating, "We built it, paid for it, and are going to keep it," referring to the Panama Canal. Many Panamanians argue that Torrijos's brash and effective negotiation tactics caused the U.S. to ramp up covert activity in Panama, leading to his death in a mysterious plane explosion in 1981. This plane crash occurred shortly after Ronald Reagan assumed office as President of the United States, and 3 months after Ecuadorian President Jaime Roldos Aguilera died under similar circumstances. The cause of this plane explosion remains disputed today. After the sudden death of Omar Torrijos, his second-in-command, General Manuel Noriega, became the de facto leader of Panama. Noriega, already well known to the U.S. intelligence community as an informant, was seen as a ruler that could be controlled by U.S. interests. However, Noriega's usefulness would run out in 1989 when President H.W. Bush launched a full-scale military invasion of Panama to arrest Noriega on drug trafficking charges. Despite rampant human rights violations, this invasion would be dubbed Operation Just Cause. Here is a short video of Jimmy Carter talking about his negotiations with Omar Torrijos, and it just kind of highlights the type of leader that Torrijos was and the volatile political situation that was created by the negotiation of the 77 Carter-Torrijos Treaty.
I was elected as president. My predecessors in office had promised the Panamanian people to treat them fairly. The prospect of relinquishing control over the Panama Canal was very unpopular in my country, and my predecessors didn't want to address this difficult issue. And I saw it as a basic human right, that is treating other people fairly. And it became clear to me as I studied it very deeply that the original agreement consummated between the United States and Panama was not fair to the Panamanian people because it was signed in the middle of the night in secret when no Panamanian was directly involved in the process. And I wanted to do what was right and fair to the Panamanian people. So I worked with a very good partner, Omar Torrijos, who was the president of Panama, and we negotiated 2 treaties that were very fair to the Panamanians and to the United States. And these were negotiated very openly and with a great deal of concessions on both sides. And we had to get 2/3 of the U.S. Senate to approve, which was the most difficult political challenge of my entire life. And it was a very good thing to do. It was the right thing to do. It's worked out beautifully ever since, and far better than anybody ever expected. But it was still very unpopular in my country. As a matter, just as an example, there were 20 U.S. senators who voted for the treaties who had to be re-elected that year, and out of the 20, only 7 of them came back to the Senate the next January. So you can see it was a very great and courageous thing for the people of my government to approve this treaty, which was very badly needed and good for Panama. It was good for the United States. It was good for the entire world. And I have been overjoyed and very grateful to see how well the Panamanians have conducted the operation of the canal since they assumed control. There's any doubt that the income from the canal has been a very beneficial thing to the economic progress for Panama. But I think the fact that the Panamanians were treated fairly and were given sovereignty over all their territory has been a factor that cements together the people's commitment to honest and fair elections. And I would say that since 1990, since 1994, that the elections here have been quite honest and fair. And I believe that every person in Panama not only is proud of their ownership and control of the canal, perceives this as one of the foundations, not only for democracy and freedom and equity within Panama, but their relationship to the outside.
So now diving into the 1989 Panamanian invasion, dubbed Operation Just Cause. Again, the argument that is made in my research is that the U.S. invasion of Panama was a diversionary war unrelated to any credible national security risk, but rather served the domestic political purpose of rehabilitating Bush's weak, and this is President H.W. Bush's weak presidential image, popularly known as his, quote, wimp problem, while simultaneously serving as a test for new military technology prior to a decisive victory in Operation Desert Storm, which would go on to define the Bush presidency. The hasty launch of the full-scale military invasion of Panama resulted in mass collateral damage and civilian casualties, which were then minimized by U.S. officials due to a flagrant violation of the Geneva Convention's rule of proportionality, which inflicted a civilian death toll that was at least 4.5 times higher than military casualties in the enemy. Both the planning and the decision-making processes revealed that the invasion was launched by President H.W. Bush in 1989 after facilitating a failed Panamanian military coup in October of 1989 and legitimized by a redefined, aggressive unilateral foreign policy that would later be employed in the Middle East. For Bush, the capture of General Manuel Noriega was never a top priority, but rather it was used as a means to justify an illegal invasion launched for political purposes. In many ways, the U.S. invasion of Panama was almost a dry run for Operation Desert Storm in 1990. And in this slide, you'll see a picture of President George H.W. Bush, who then was director of the CIA, with General Manuel Noriega. As director of the CIA, Bush actually had a working relationship with Manuel Noriega, who was considered a useful drug informant at the time. And just to kind of paint a picture of what a full-scale U.S. military invasion looked like in Panama, U.S. forces entered Panama City on the morning of December 20th, 1989, at about midnight. A force of approximately 26,000, the largest single invading force since D-Day, entered the country mostly by air, alongside Hellfire bombings and targeted missile attacks. During the engagement, both stealth aircrafts and Apache helicopters were utilized for the first time in military history. On January 3rd, U.S. forces arrested Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega to stand trial on drug trafficking charges in the U.S., marking the end of the war. When the dust settled, according to the Pentagon's conservative numbers, 20,000 Panamanian citizens had lost their homes, over 2,700 families had been displaced, 26 American servicemen were killed, and 202 civilians lie dead, with countless others wounded, causing over $2 billion in material damage. However, credible evidence suggests that the Bush administration approved casualty numbers were manipulated for political purposes. In this photo, you'll see this massive invading force was launched to combat the Panamanian Defense Force, known as the PDF, which was largely comprised of citizen volunteers with limited weaponry and no air force. Now, according to Hendrickson's four propositions to test for a diversionary use of force, a conflict is assumed to be diversionary in nature if it meets four requirements. The first requirement is that a group of advisors is kept to a minimum. In the case of Panama, no congressional leaders or foreign allies were included in Bush's decision-making process, and opposition was actually eliminated in the form of General Warner and General Cisneros, who we will discuss in just a minute. Hendrickson's second proposition is that diplomacy remains possible as the invasion constitutes a premature use of force. In regard to Operation Just Cause, strong diplomatic ties remained intact up until the time of the invasion, and as a former CIA employee, the activities and location of General Noriega were already well known. At the time, the CIA and the DEA actually had deemed Noriega more of an intelligence asset than a liability. George H.W. Bush also had a personal and, quote, friendly relationship with General Noriega from his time as director of the CIA. Noriega remained on CIA payroll as an informant until 1988, just 1 year before Bush invaded Panama. Also, central lines of communication remained intact from Reagan's administration, of which Bush was vice president. Now, Hendrickson's third proposition states that Congress will criticize the president for recklessly using force. Now, in the case of Operation Just Cause, in general, members of Congress avoided explicit yes or no votes at the onset. However, they did voice criticism for the president's military actions while the invasion was in progress, and this was bipartisan criticism. Hendrickson's fourth proposition states that foreign states will criticize the American president after the use of force. A UN draft resolution dated December 22, 1989, quote, strongly deplored the intervention in Panama by the armed forces of the United States of America. It was stated that this constituted a flagrant violation of international law and of the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of states, and the resolution goes on to demand the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Panama effective immediately. The George H.W. Bush administration's decision to invade Panama actually fulfilled all four of Hendrickson's prerequisite requirements for a diversionary war. As the invasion of Panama became imminent, and growing concerns in Washington and in the media over a possible diversionary and illegal U.S. invasions grew, President Bush addressed the nation to lay out his administration's pretense for invasion in no uncertain terms. The pretense for invasion laid out by Bush was, number one, to safeguard American lives. However, it was stated by General Warner, commander of U.S. Southern Command, that even though there was some harassment by U.S. forces and American civilians in Panama by the PDF, it was not serious and the U.S. was in good position to defend their interests. Also undermining Bush's claim was the fact that during the course of the invasion, nearly a dozen U.S. citizens were held hostage and 3 were murdered. Bush's second pretense for invasion was to defend democracy in Panama. However, U.S. forces ignored democracy in Panama by installing their own puppet leadership in the form of the Endara government after Noriega's capture. Human rights violations under Noriega, although unacceptably high, were mild compared to the records of U.S.-supported regimes in Guatemala and in El Salvador. Also, the 1988 Panama elections had been tainted by misconducts on both sides. Noriega's military forces were reported to have confiscated ballots, and the Ndara opposition received at least $110 million from the CIA in an attempt to buy the election. So the freedom agenda of restoring democracy in Panama was largely used as a means to legitimize an illegal invasion. Bush's third pretense for invasion, laid out in his national address, was to combat drug trafficking in Central America. Now, the CIA and the DEA had kept a close eye on Noriega's nefarious activity for over a decade, with Bush himself actually utilizing his relationship with him as an informant. The DEA had long argued against removing Noriega, finding that his cooperation, well known to only be partial cooperation, was better than nothing. And they actually, as I stated before, did keep Noriega on CIA payroll through 1988. Also, the DEA insisted that Noriega actually helped to slow down the flow of drugs through Panama. In the immediate year after the invasion, the U.S. government accounting offices claimed that the drug trafficking in Panama was considerably worse than it had been under Noriega, stating that trafficking may have doubled after the invasion. And then finally, Bush's fourth pretense for invasion laid out in his national address was to protect the integrity of the 1977 Panama Canal Treaty. This is an interesting notion because the invasion was actually illegal under the 1977 Carter-Torrijos Treaty itself, which actually states that, quote, the United States of America, in the exercise of its rights to assure the Panama Canal shall remain open, neutral, secure, and accessible, does not mean, nor shall it be interpreted as, a right of intervention of the United States in the internal affairs of Panama. And intervention shall never be directed against the territorial integrity or political independence of Panama. So the notion of an illegitimate invasion was very much supported by not only indifference to these principles, but also by many U.S. generals. Among these generals was Frederick Warner, Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Southern Command, who stated that Noriega, quote, never posed a credible threat to the canal or Americans in Panama. He stated that there is no legitimate reason for the United States to interfere in Panama internal affairs, and if the United States did interfere, it would undermine democracy in Panama rather than help it. Prior to the 1989 Panama invasion, Warner was fired by Dick Cheney with no explanation except the president had decided to make a change. Warner was replaced by General Maxwell Mad Max Thurman, who was described as a general who would not make excuses but would get things done. As the new commander-in-chief of U.S. Southern Command in charge of Panama invasion, Thurman made no secret his belief that Warner and many of the Spanish-speaking officers on his staff had suffered from clientitis, or too much knowledge and therefore sympathy for the Panamanians. The lack of credible threat to U.S. interests, along with criticism from high-ranking military officials, raises the question, why Panama? Why launch a full-scale invasion of a politically and militarily inept, poverty-stricken country? Well, the answer to this question lies in domestic U.S. political interests relating to George H.W. Bush's public persona that were proving to be particularly debilitating when trying to enact his legislative agenda. Here, Bush's past relationship with Manuel Noriega proved to be particularly debilitating, giving rise to the national outcry that the president was, in fact, a wimp. Now, I can't overemphasize what a big deal this was at the time, The idea that President Bush was a quote wimp was actually on the cover of several magazines at the time, including Newsweek, which is depicted in your slide here. And this was largely because, as vice president, Bush had never publicly disagreed with a Reagan policy. As a result, Bush was constantly being criticized in the media for being a wimp and, quote, not his own man. Congressional Democrats seized on this opportunity and framed Bush's willingness to bargain with drug traffickers as an attempt to protect his old friend Noriega. When a U.S. facilitated coup failed in Panama in 1988, 1 year prior to the U.S. invasion, the Bush administration was again roundly criticized for its indecisiveness, and critics argued far and wide that there was a resurgence of the wimp factor. At this point, President Bush's entire administration felt the political need to resolve the situation decisively in hopes of turning a political liability into a political gain, especially as Noriega claimed to have Bush, quote, by the balls. According to political scientist Jane Kramer, what had been widely called the wimp factor for Bush emerged in spades over the Noriega issue. Bush was again following Reagan's policy, and it was perceived that Bush was being intimidated by Noriega. Each time anything happened in Panama and Bush failed to resolve the situation, he was once again criticized for being a wimp. Brent Scowcroft, National Security Advisor to Bush and all-around best friend of the president, stated that, "We were sort of like the Keystone Cops. Maybe we were looking for an opportunity to show that we were not as messed up as Congress kept saying we were. The administration had to find a way to respond to the whole wimp factor." The Bush administration responded by launching a diversionary war in Panama, which emphasized political expediency over military objective. This resulted in excessive collateral damage, which stemmed from limited planning and the employment of excessive military force and untested weaponry. A congressional investigation reveals that the Joint Chiefs refused to open planning documents to determine if there was adequate planning to avoid civilian casualties. And according to Physicians for Human Rights in their investigation, in the case of Panama, it is important to examine whether the military commander ordering the attack took appropriate precautions and whether he knew or should have anticipated that the destruction of the military objective would likely cause civilian suffering out of proportion to the military advantage gained. Also, the employment of military technologies that only had a tenuous connection to the military objective at hand, such as laser-guided missiles and stealth fighters and Apache helicopters, compounded this collateral damage. In many ways, the Bush Doctrine had its roots in Panama, where the country served as a testing ground for both modern warfare and America's aggressive unilateral foreign policy. A Congressional Armed Services Subcommittee, in a report titled The Invasion of Panama, How Many Innocent Bystanders Perished, stated that it was preferable that the stealth fighter be used rather than the FB-111, since the stealth had never been used in a combat situation, and the FB had. Lawsuits filed by 60 U.S. Latin American companies based in Panama alleged that the U.S. action against Panama was done in a torturous, careless, and negligent manner with disregard for property and innocent Panamanian residents. And in these photos, you can see how it depicts some of the indiscriminate nature of the initial invasions, as civilians were gunned down while fleeing, and a 10-block residential area known as Chorrillos was leveled, inflicting further casualties. According to all casualty tabulations, including official Pentagon numbers, The invasion of Panama resulted in a, quote, flagrant violation of the rule of proportionality, prohibiting attacks against military objectives if injury to civilians is likely to be excessive in relation to the anticipated military gain. What was touted as a surgical operation actually resulted in 10 civilians killed for every American military casualty, according to official U.S. counts. Approximately 85% of Panamanian lives lost during the invasion and its violent aftermath were civilian, according to Physicians for Human Rights. The, quote, surgical operation conducted by American forces actually inflicted a civilian death toll that was at least 4.5 times higher than military casualties in the enemy and 12 or 13 times higher than the casualties suffered by U.S. troops, according to Human Rights Watch. And according to the Central American Human Rights Commission, civilian fatalities were at least 10 times greater than the U.S. figure of 202, indicating that U.S. air and ground troops killed at least 2,000 to 3,000 Panamanian people. This raises the question, how does a, quote, surgical operation touted by the U.S. government result in almost 10 civilians killed by official U.S. counts for every American military casualty? Well, according to General Maxwell Mad Max Thurman, Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Southern Command, widespread collateral damage occurred during the initial invasion because a, quote, deliberate effort was made to use highly sophisticated weaponry and tactics to present an overwhelming superiority of firepower that would make any resistance unthinkable. These tactics would go on to be employed in George H.W. Bush's Gulf War and later during George W. Bush's initial invasion of Iraq, appropriately named Shock and Awe. The fallout from the use of this highly sophisticated weaponry in poor urban neighborhoods resulted in the complete destruction of the El Chorrillo neighborhood, which equated to about 10 city blocks. It also caused civilian dead to overwhelm morgues, and storage facilities actually included numerous dead children that were not reported in official U.S. counts. According to General Mark Cisneros, commander of the U.S. Army South and highest ranking Latino in the U.S. Army, we could have done it with less troops and less destruction. We made it look like we were battling Goliath. We are mesmerized with firepower. We have all these new gadgets, laser-guided missiles and stealth fighters, and we were just dying to use that stuff. The indiscriminate use of untested weaponry subsequently led to a limited cover-up of the civilian dead. According to Physicians for Human Rights, in order to hide a botched invasion in which U.S. troops violated the rule of proportionality, the U.S. military engaged in a cover-up of both civilian and enemy dead through the incineration of corpses and burial of remains in common graves prior to identification. Regarding casualty numbers, U.S. Southern Command, quote, fumbled for some days coming up with various casualty numbers, finally releasing the figure of 202 civilian dead. However, a January 10th internal Army memo states, estimates of 1,000 civilian casualties is about right. Admiral David Chandler of U.S. Southern Command confirmed that U.S. forces buried casualties in a common grave in the Monte Esperanza Cemetery, which held unclaimed bodies. The Physicians for Human Rights delegation also goes on to state that in order to cover up mistakes regarding the civilian dead, U.S. forces neglected counts and categorized many of the civilian dead falsely as military combatants. Regarding these backyard burials and incineration of corpses, A congressional subcommittee investigation stated that the Office of the Joint Chiefs again, quote, refused to cooperate with this subcommittee as it sought to access documents that could prove or disprove this point. A Congressional Armed Service Subcommittee defended the military cover-up, stated, "It is the nature of the military bureaucracy to suppress damaging information or fudge. No young company commander would want to report a high death toll and risk ruining his career. To impose such a burden on the company commanders is to beg for falsification." And in these photos, you can see depicted the exhumation of common graves of both civilian and military dead. The image on the right is actually from a 1990 60 Minutes investigation in which civilians were exhumed and subsequently identified by family members on live television. And actually, Ambler Moss, the former U.S. ambassador to Panama, even publicly stated at the time in an interview with the New York Times that, quote, "My gut instinct is that there is an awful lot of parties around there that have interest in covering up numbers," referring to the civilian dead. Now, this inability to account for the numerous civilian dead has created widespread anger on the part of the Panamanian poor, who continue to raise questions regarding casualties incurred during the U.S. invasion today. The main source of anger continues to be the manner in which civilians were killed, unexpectedly and brutally. An example being a grandmother preparing dinner was killed with her legs destroyed and her insides coming out onto her husband. Also, over 13% of dead civilians were children. The brutality of the killing has given rise to a call of reparations and a national day of mourning in Panama. The anger felt by Panamanians, especially the urban poor, is in many cases understandable. These individuals lost everything in the invasion and want the U.S. to pay for it monetarily and by accepting responsibility. To date, the U.S. government has refused to accept responsibility for the civilian dead, stating that, while the United States government is aware of the damages and regrets your loss, there is no legal authority to compensate you for your loss. Also today, the invasion is still widely discussed in Central American news media. According to the Panama Foreign Ministry, recent investigations conducted through Panamanian government and in the media aim to identify the victims and reclaim the country's collective memory. They also aim to, quote, pave the way for reparations to be paid to families of the victims and for the history to be honored in school curriculums and public monuments and generate a comprehensive count of all civilian and military casualties. So to sum things up, the U.S. war in Panama, dubbed Operation Just Cause, was a diversionary war launched for domestic political purposes relating to Bush's weak domestic political persona and was unrelated to any credible national security risk at the time. The hasty launch of the comprehensive invasion resulted in mass collateral damage and chaos within the country, causing continued anger among the urban poor. Both the planning and the decision-making process revealed that the invasion was compelled by domestic political imperatives created by the Bush administration after a failed PDF coup in October of 1989 and legitimized by a redefined aggressive unilateral foreign policy that would be employed in the Middle East. However, the debate over the number of casualties quickly reduces itself to an argument conducted in a vacuum over what level of civilian casualties is acceptable. Controversially over the number of civilian casualties should not obscure the important debate on the manner in which those individuals died. I look forward to answering any questions that you guys may have, whether that be in person or virtually going forward. And I would like to thank everybody for taking the time to listen to this lecture. And I hope to answer any questions to follow. Thank you.